What if your health was more about your biology than your choices? What if conscientiousness, the quiet engine of self-control, was fading in a world of cheap dopamine and constant distraction? This isn't just about obesity. It's about inequality, AI, and the future of medicine. As artificial intelligence accelerates, so does our ability to change bodies, minds, and maybe even fate itself. But with this power comes the question, are we engineering a healthier future or escaping responsibility for who we are?
Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a stack of fascinating sources today.
Yeah, really interesting stuff.
And we're going to plunge into some genuinely uncomfortable, complex, maybe even surprising ideas about society, health, and, well, the future.
Absolutely. This material, it covers a wide spectrum, doesn't it? You got the links between poverty and obesity, then you jump to AI, future medicine.
It seems kind of all over the place at first glance.
It does, but when you start digging in, you see the connections are actually really compelling.
So our mission in this deep dive, as always, is to try and cut through the noise. We want to pull out the most important insights from these sources, maybe challenge some common assumptions along the way.
And help you, the listener, connect the dots between these topics that might seem unrelated on the surface.
Yeah, getting below the sort of surface-level headlines.
Exactly. Understanding the underlying dynamics at play in these really big issues.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this source material and see what unexpected insights we can uncover.
Where should we start?
Let's start with a big one. And it's definitely a topic that tends to spark debate. The link between poverty and obesity.
Right. It's a connection we hear about all the time.
Yeah.
And the usual story, the conventional narrative, it generally goes something like, poverty causes obesity.
Because people can't afford healthy food, maybe can't afford a gym membership, that kind of thing.
That's the standard line. But the sources we looked at, they really push back against that simple explanation.
Yeah, they challenge it pretty head on. One point that jumped out at me was how sort of counterintuitive it is. Wealthy people, on average, they actually consume less of something that costs money. Food.
Which is weird when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
And the sources also question that whole idea that processed junk food is automatically the cheapest option.
Right. They suggest, basic ingredients, think beans, rice, certain vegetables, they can often be less expensive per calorie or per nutrient anyway.
And what's fascinating is how the sources then pivot. They move away from just access and cost and introduce this personality concept, trait conscientiousness. And they make a pretty bold claim here. They suggest that this trait, combined with something they call food drive, basically, how much you inherently like food or are motivated by it.
Your appetite, essentially.
Yeah, sort of your innate drive to eat. They're saying those two things could potentially explain 80%, maybe even more, of the variation we see in obesity levels today.
Wow, 80%. That's a huge claim. So, trait conscientiousness. It sounds a bit academic. What does that actually mean in this context, according to these sources?
Think of it as a fundamental part of your personality. It involves things like discipline, organization, controlling your impulses, planning ahead.
Delayed gratification.
Exactly. Delaying gratification is a big part of it. The sources mention the concept behind the classic marshmallow experiment.
Right, the kids and the marshmallows.
Yeah, though they note issues with the replication of that specific study, the underlying idea, choosing a bigger reward later over a smaller one, now that's a key piece of conscientiousness. It's about having that sort of internal grit, making harder choices now for a better outcome down the road.
And the sources connect this trait, this conscientiousness, directly to other life outcomes, too. Not just health, but things like wealth.
Oh, yeah. They argue it might be the single biggest behavioral driver pushing people towards, or I guess away from, poverty over the long haul.
The biggest.
According to their analysis, yeah. The sources describe these different life archetypes based on combinations of like rich-poor and high-low conscientiousness. And they highlight that the behavioral patterns tied to high or low conscientiousness seem to be the strongest predictor of someone's long-term financial path.
Well, that naturally brings up the whole nature versus nurture debate, doesn't it? Genetics versus environment. What do the sources say about that based on things like twin and adoption studies?
They lean pretty heavily on those studies. According to the sources, these studies suggest genetics play a profound role. Not just in general personality, but even specifically in things like our food choices.
How specific?
The claim is that after early adolescence, maybe around age 12 or 13, The influence of the shared home environment on eating habits becomes almost like undetectable compared to genetic factors.
Wow. So your parents' influence fades pretty quickly in that regard.
Apparently so, according to this view. They also raise some questions about the impact of things like emotional regulation issues, often linked to adverse childhood experiences or ACEs.
Yeah, that's a big focus usually.
It is. But they suggest that when you look at twin studies that control for genetics, the impact of those experiences on adult outcomes might actually be less significant than often assumed, especially compared to underlying genetic predispositions.
Okay. There was a specific example in the material about food deserts that seemed to really hammer home this point about individual traits potentially mattering more than just access.
Oh, that study. Yeah, it's quite striking, isn't it? It found that people living in food deserts who did have access to a car, meaning they could easily drive to bigger grocery stores outside their immediate neighborhood.
You'd think they'd eat healthier.
You would. But they actually tended to become fatter, on average, than the residents without cars.
Seriously, how does that work?
Well, the source's interpretation is that having better access didn't suddenly make them crave kale and grilled chicken. It just allowed them to buy, say, more of the junk food they already preferred, or maybe slightly better brands of it.
So access enabled their existing preferences, basically.
That's the argument. It illustrates how individual preference and these underlying drives linked back to conscientiousness and food drive can sometimes override the simple factor of environmental access.
This whole line of thinking, then, it seems to lead the sources to kind of critique approaches that focus only on external social factors to solve complex problems like obesity.
Right. The argument isn't saying that things like nutritional education or maybe regulating food ads aimed at kids or offering mental health support. It's not that those things are bad.
No, they seem like good ideas.
They are acknowledged as potentially helpful, sure, but maybe only on the margins. The sources suggest these might lead to, say, a 5% or maybe a 20% improvement max.
Okay.
But the core critique is that these interventions don't fundamentally address what the sources see as the major underlying variables: trait conscientiousness and food drive.
And without tackling those.
They argue you're leaving the vast majority of the problem, maybe 80% or more, unsolved. They use analogies like trying to dramatically boost an athlete's performance without considering their inherent genetic talent.
Or another one was like trying to fix deep family problems with just therapy when maybe there's an underlying, perhaps genetic, psychological condition really driving the behavior.
Exactly. It's about targeting the root cause as they see it.
Now, these are clearly sensitive ideas, especially when you start linking outcomes to personal traits or genetics, particularly around poverty. How do the sources handle that sensitivity?
They explicitly acknowledge it's uncomfortable. They talk about the risk of being accused of, blaming the victim.
Which is a common criticism in these discussions.
Absolutely. Their response, as presented in the material we reviewed, is that the focus needs to be on understanding causality, what is actually driving these outcomes, rather than getting bogged down in assigning moral blame.
So understanding first, solutions second.
Pretty much. They argue that only by understanding the real drivers, even the uncomfortable ones, can you hope to develop effective solutions. The material also neutrally reports the source's perspective, that there might be ideological biases sometimes.
Biases where?
Within some academic circles or public discussions, potentially favoring purely social explanations and maybe dismissing or downplaying genetic or trait-based factors because they're seen as politically incorrect, even if the evidence points towards their significance.
Okay, interesting point on potential biases and interpretation. Let's shift gears slightly, but maybe stay with some potentially uncomfortable correlations. The sources also bring up a provocative idea about intelligence levels and political viewpoints.
Ah, yes, that one. So the claim made in the sources, and we're just reporting this neutrally here, is that there seems to be a correlation. On average, people with lower measured intelligence tend to lean more towards authoritarianism.
And how are they defining authoritarianism here?
In this context, the source defines it as opposing social liberties and simultaneously favoring more government economic regulation and control.
Okay. And the flip side?
Conversely, individuals with higher average measured intelligence tend, again, on average, to be more libertine, favoring freer economies and a more live and let live approach to social issues.
Huh. Do they offer any explanation for why that correlation might exist?
The sources float an idea that it might stem from how people approach politics. The suggestion is that those with lower intelligence might tend to sort of feel their political positions more emotionally.
Reacting viscerally?
Maybe. whereas those with higher intelligence might be more inclined to think about political issues, perhaps applying more rational or economic analysis, focusing on, like, marginal effects and trade-offs.
Interesting distinction between feeling and thinking politics. And the sources then connect this idea to a broader discussion about societal progress, right?
Precisely. They propose that increasing the aggregate intelligence in a society, and this is key, it means both human intelligence plus potentially integrating advanced machine intelligence.
So humans plus AI.
Yes. That combined intelligence could lead to what they describe as a predictably better place.
Meaning?
Meaning potentially a world with less war, more prosperity, greater stability, maybe even better environmental outcomes.
And the reasoning behind that is?
The reasoning presented is that as collective intelligence rises, rational economic thinking might increasingly outweigh purely emotional or tribal reasoning in big decisions. The sources specifically argue that war, for instance, almost never makes logical economic sense in the modern world.
So more rational actors might lead to fewer conflicts.
That's the hypothesis.
This is clearly where the discussion about AI and exponential growth fits in.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize that AI's progress isn't linear, it's exponential. They bring up Paul Krugman's, infamous early prediction about the internet.
The fax machine comparison.
Yeah, that the internet's impact wouldn't be much greater than the fax machine. It's used as a classic example of how our linear human thinking often fails to grasp exponential curves.
And they point to predictions like Ray Kurzweil's.
Right, his revised forecast, putting artificial general intelligence, AGI, potentially arriving as early as 2029. It's pretty soon.
Very soon.
And the sources suggest AI could even help accelerate scientific progress itself by overcoming limitations like simply the finite number of human scientists available to work on complex problems.
So AI could become a research partner, essentially.
Or even drive discovery in ways we can't yet. And despite all this potential disruption from AI and other factors, the sources also highlighted something else: the remarkable resilience of historical progress.
What do they mean by that?
Well, it's an interesting point. If you look at long-term historical development, like GDP per capita or technological advancement, and you plot it on a log scale.
So you can see percentage changes more clearly.
Exactly. Progress appears surprisingly consistent over the long run. Even huge setbacks, world wars, pandemics, massive depressions, they cause dips, sure, but the underlying upward trajectory seems to just keep going.
Why is that, according to the sources?
They suggest it's because of these deep-seated buffers in human systems. Things like the ability to accumulate abundance and knowledge during good times, and then conversely, the immense incentive to innovate and rebuild during crises. These factors together seem to keep progress chugging along despite major challenges.
That's actually kind of optimistic. The sources also briefly touched on nepotism and success, which seems to loop back to those earlier points about traits and outcomes.
Yeah, they discuss it, but mainly within the context of free markets. They acknowledge that obviously connections and inherited wealth give people short-term advantages. That's undeniable. But the sources argue that in truly competitive free markets over the long term, it's usually performance and genuine capability traits, often linked back to intelligence and conscientiousness, that tend to win out.
So merit eventually surfaces.
In a competitive enough environment, that's the argument. They also float the idea that what looks like simple nepotism might sometimes be partly influenced by behavioral genetics. Meaning, smart, capable, conscientious parents might pass on some of those traits genetically to their kids, who then are genuinely capable of succeeding in the family business or field. It's not just the name.
Ah, okay. So nature and nurture interacting again.
Exactly. They use the example of the Paul brothers in their prime drink. The argument made is that despite the huge celebrity endorsement, ultimately it's the product's performance in the market, whether people actually like it and buy it, that determines long-term success. Though they do add a caveat that nepotism might play a bigger role in less purely competitive fields, like maybe politics compared to economics.
Okay, interesting nuance there. Let's pivot back to health now, but focus on a specific aspect. The sources really champion muscle mass.
Yes, this was a major theme. The sources make a really strong case for muscle mass, not just being, for bodybuilders or athletes. They frame it as a crucial longevity organ for everyone.
A longevity organ, that's a strong term.
It is. They argue that having more muscle and less fat, basically, improving your body composition, leads to profoundly better health outcomes. And often, this is more significant than just hitting a healthy weight, according to something like BMI.
So composition over just scale weight.
Precisely. And they suggest that the standard medical approach often kind of misses this emphasis.
How so?
Well, the critique in the sources is that routine medical checkups tend to focus very heavily on blood work, cholesterol, blood pressure, the standard markers, which are important, of course.
Sure.
But they might overlook the critical importance of resistance training and actually building or maintaining muscle mass. This could be a real blind spot, even for people who look healthy on paper.
Like the skinny fat phenomenon.
Exactly. Someone with low muscle mass, but a normal weight, or even aging individuals whose blood work looks great, but they're progressively losing muscle, that's sarcopenia, which has huge health implications. The sources suggest doctors often aren't proactively discussing muscle as a key health pillar.
So looking ahead then, the sources discuss the future of medicine, specifically targeting this area, muscle and obesity. What do they see coming?
One of the major developments they predict is the arrival of effective, non-androgenic anabolic drugs, meaning compounds that can safely help people build muscle mass, but without the negative hormonal side effects you get with traditional anabolic steroids.
Ah, muscle building without the roid rage or other issues.
Essentially, yes, safer anabolics. The sources mention potential targets, like maybe regulating myostatin. Myostatin is a protein your body naturally produces to limit how much muscle you can build.
So these drugs would block the blocker.
Kind of, yeah. Imagine drugs that could safely lift that natural limit. Think of those incredibly muscular cows you sometimes see pictures of, the Belgian blues. They have myostatin defect. The idea is finding a safe way to achieve a similar controlled effect in humans.
Okay, that's one piece. And they envision combining this with something else.
Yes, they see a future involving what they call dual therapy. This would combine the existing anorectic drugs like the GLP-1 agonists, Ozempic, Wegovy, that are making waves now.
The ones that reduce appetite.
Right. Those drugs effectively target food drive and appetite, leading to fat loss. You combine those with these future non-androgenic anabolics that build muscle.
Ah, a two-pronged attack.
Exactly. Attack the fat mass with the anorectic side and build the muscle mass with the anabolic side. The sources argue this could be incredibly powerful, much more comprehensive solutions for obesity and sarcopenia than we have today.
And it would make exercise more effective too, presumably.
Significantly more effective, especially for people who naturally struggle to put on muscle, even when they lift weights. This could really lower the barrier.
What sort of ripple effects could this dual therapy have on, say, different industries?
Well, we're already seeing some effects just from the current weight loss drugs, right? Like, apparently there's an increased demand for skin removal surgery after massive weight loss.
Makes sense.
The sources predict a major boom in what you might call the healthy junk food industry, or maybe high-protein fun snacking.
How does that follow?
The idea is if drugs make it much easier for people with naturally high food drive to manage their total calorie intake, they don't necessarily have to give up enjoyable, palatable foods entirely. They could just eat less of them, or versions reformulated to be higher in protein or lower in sugar.
So you can have your cake and eat it too, just maybe a smaller protein-fortified piece.
Sort of. The sources even envision this kind of ongoing war between the food industry constantly innovating to make foods even more hyperpalatable and the pharmaceutical industry developing ever better anorectic medications to counteract the urge to overeat them.
Which could, ironically, lead to incredibly tasty, cheap food in the future.
Because the physiological drive to binge on it might be chemically managed for a large portion of the population. It's a strange potential future.
It really is. Finally, the sources touch on a very practical challenge for someone listening right now who wants to apply some of these health insights, particularly around muscle and optimization.
Yeah, this is a key practical point. The sources highlight the difficulty many people face in finding healthcare practitioners, doctors, mostly who are really equipped, or maybe just willing, to engage in proactive health optimization.
Going beyond just treating disease.
Yeah. Exactly. Going beyond the basic blood panels and standard checkups to actually discuss personalized goals like how can I increase my muscle mass safely, or should we investigate potential low-grade nutrient deficiencies with more specific evidence-based testing,
As
opposed to maybe just relying on less validated information or protocols. The sources bring up, as an example, how the self-esteem movement that pushed for participation trophies was apparently based on some flawed scientific premises, leading to kind of ineffective outcomes. The analogy is about needing evidence-based approaches.
Right.
So the challenge is finding doctors who can provide that level of tailored, evidence-based guidance for optimization, not just baseline health. And the sources note that this difficulty can sometimes push people towards well, less reputable sources or influencers out of sheer frustration.
Because the mainstream system isn't always set up for that proactive approach.
It often isn't, according to this perspective. They emphasize that while major health bodies usually provide solid, validated recommendations, the protocols pushed by individual online influencers might not have that same rigorous scientific backing. Finding that middle ground with a knowledgeable practitioner can be tough. Okay, so we've taken quite a deep dive today through sources covering some really complex and sometimes uncomfortable terrain.
Definitely. Challenging common beliefs about poverty, individual traits, the role of genetics.
And exploring these big societal implications of intelligence, technology, AI.
And finally, looking at the cutting edge and the potential future of health and medicine, especially around body composition.
It seems really clear from these sources that, many of the big problems we face, whether societal or health related, they really don't have simple, easy answers.
No, and they strongly argue that these fundamental factors, things like individual traits, personality, genetics, they might play a much more significant role than we're often comfortable acknowledging. Yeah, we definitely explored some uncomfortable truths about inherent differences, maybe limitations, but also some really exciting potential futures for science and medicine.
Right, where interventions could potentially directly influence biological drives like appetite or our capacity to build muscle.
This material, it really shows how interconnected all these issues are, doesn't it? And it underlines the argument from the sources that understanding the real drivers, even the difficult, uncomfortable ones, is absolutely essential if we want to find effective solutions.
You can't fix a problem if you don't understand its root cause, essentially.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of this? If, as these sources strongly suggest, things like genetics and individual traits are such powerful drivers of our outcomes, and if technology and medicine are rapidly developing ways to directly influence some of these very traits like appetite, like muscle growth.
It raises some huge questions.
It really does. So here's a provocative thought for you to mull over. How do we, as a society, navigate this tension? The tension between our deeply held values of equality, fairness, universal support, and what the science, according to these sources, suggests about inherent individual differences.
And maybe even more profoundly, what are the ethical frontiers we are rapidly approaching as we gain the technological power to directly modify core aspects of human potential itself?
Yeah, big questions to think about.